John Boles is the William P. Hobby Professor of History at Rice University. He has a PhD from the University of Virginia in history from 1969. He's the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including a Fulbright Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities, from the Burkitt Foundation, from the Texas and Louisiana Committees for the Humanities. He's the 2016 and 2017 president of the Southern Historical Association. He's the editor emeritus of the Journal of Southern History. He's the editor of the University Press of Kentucky's Religion in the South monograph series. He has, over the course of his career, directed 61 doctoral dissertations, which is 61 more than I have directed so far in my career. He's authored or edited over 20 books on Southern history, focusing on themes and topics such as religion, race, politics, and higher education. And his most recent book is called Jefferson, Architect of American Liberty, with Basic Books in 2017. It's over 600 pages, and it has received really positive reviews, widely reviewed all over the place, including one in the Washington Post that called it the finest one-volume biography ever written on an American president. And so we have with us tonight John Boles. Let me read just a little from the dust jacket for this book to situate the project in context before he comes up. The description of the book goes as follows. As Alexander Hamilton's star has risen, Thomas Jefferson's has fallen, largely owing to their divergent views on race. Once seen as the most influential American champion of liberty and democracy, Jefferson is now remembered largely for his relationship with his slave, Sally Hemings, and for electing not to free her or most of the other people he owned. In this magisterial biography, the eminent scholar John Boles does not ignore the aspects of Jefferson that trouble us today, but strives to see him in full and to understand him amid the sweeping upheaval of his times. We followed Jefferson from his early success as an abnormally precocious student and lawyer in colonial Virginia through his drafting of the Declaration of Independence at age 33, his travels in Europe on the eve of the French Revolution, his acidic personal battles with Hamilton, his triumphant ascent to the presidency in 1801, his prodigious efforts to found the University of Virginia, and beyond. From Jefferson's inspiring defenses of political and religious liberty to his heterodox abridgment of Christian belief, Boles explores Jefferson's expansive intellectual life and the profound impact of his ideas on the world. Boles overturns conventional wisdom at every turn, arguing, among other things, that Jefferson did not, as later Southerners would deem the states rightfully superior to the federal government. Yet Boles's view is not limited to politics and public life. We also meet the Jefferson, the architect, scientist, bibliophile, and gourmet, as well as Jefferson, the gentle father and widower, doting on his daughters and longing for escape from the rancorous world of politics. As this authoritative, even-handed portrait shows, Jefferson challenges us more thoroughly than any other founder. He was at once the most idealistic, contradictory, and quintessentially American of them all. The talk tonight gives us just a slice of Jefferson, particularly focused on Jefferson's constitutional thought. John will talk tonight about Jeffersonian constitutionalism, words to protect our liberties. Please join me in welcoming John Boles.
Thanks very much. I don't want to spill this water. 3 weeks ago, I was speaking at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. In this room, Thomas Jefferson stood in, and there was a famous picture of Jefferson, and a famous picture of Ben Franklin, and a famous picture of George Washington. And I got up there, and right off the bat, I spilled my water all over the rostrum. So I realized I didn't belong in that company. Actually, I didn't write those words. I mean, you might have thought, since it was on a dust jacket in my book, that I wrote them. But the publisher had a PR person who did that. Sound pretty good, though, didn't it? But I mean, that wasn't me. Well, it's good to be here. Actually, I have something I'm going to partly read, mainly read, because I did a paper on Jefferson's constitutional thought. Often I just sort of talk. But one thing I have to say, I was really aggravated. I guess the older I get, the more often I get aggravated. But I was really aggravated a few months ago by an op-ed in the New York Times, because it seems to me when I talk to students, even really smart students, or even very educated Americans, they seem to me to know basically two things about Jefferson. One is that Jefferson was a hypocrite because he wrote all men are created equal and didn't free a slave, and then that he had an affair with a black woman, and that's about all they know. It's sort of like two bumper sticker moments of Jefferson's life. And if they know anything else, they may know he's president, but not much else. And so what I wanted to do in my book was, in some sense, to write a much more comprehensive book about Jefferson, to introduce modern students to this Jefferson who had an incredibly capacious mind and who was interested in everything. But anyway, this was brought home to me in this editorial in the New York Times, an op-ed, because there's an op-ed on the framers of the Constitution. And it began something like this. Well, it said the framers of the Constitution vary from the racist Thomas Jefferson, who never freed the slaves and had an affair with a black woman, to, and I stopped right there. I said, who wrote this sentence? Because I'm hoping that you all know that Thomas Jefferson was not a framer of the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson was American ambassador or minister to France when the Constitution was being written. So he was not within 3,000 miles of Philadelphia when the Constitution was being framed. But what irked me is the guy who wrote this editorial was a professor of constitutional law at Harvard Law School. And I like to say, I mean, I don't expect average people to know where Jefferson was in 1787. But I would like to believe that a professor of constitutional law at Harvard or at South Texas School of Law would know that. And it also aggravates me, the New York Times. I'm a huge fan of the New York Times. I begin every day reading the New York Times. But the New York Times didn't fact check that. And I think that sort of summarizes the plot of Jefferson in our world today. Most people have those two bumper sticker things about him, and that's all they know. And if they know anything else, it's probably wrong. I won't tell you the name of that professor of law, but aren't you kind of shocked by that? Anyway. I did go to University of Virginia because I took a course in undergraduate school on Jeffersonian and Jacksonian democracy, and I read about 500 pages of Jefferson's writings. And I loved reading his letters. And I read a wonderful book by Merrill Peterson that I know Jeff likes, called The Jefferson Image in the American Mind. And I decided to go to graduate school. I mean, I'd already decided to go to graduate school, but I decided to go to University of Virginia. This was the fall of 1965. Every single person in my residential college went to graduate school, law school, or medical school. Isn't that amazing? The alternative was going to Vietnam. So I just put that out. And I had a twin brother who did the Vietnam thing, so I thought, well, one per family is plenty. Do I have to hold this? Do I have to be real close to this? Usually they just sort of come out. Okay. Thomas Jefferson has been called, maybe I shouldn't hold so close, a Renaissance man because of the breadth of his interest and the range of his accomplishments. But perhaps his greatest skill was as a wordsmith. John Adams once referred to his peculiar felicity of expression, and certainly Jefferson's artistry with words enabled him to write with a clarity and a grace unequaled among the founding fathers. He used his power with words for many purposes. But our topic tonight is how Jefferson used words to define the purposes and powers of government and to protect the liberties of the citizens. Do I have to hold this really close, or can I, if I go back and forth? What?
You're doing great. You're good. I'm holding it. You're doing great.
I have to use both hands. I can't. Early May 1776 found 33-year-old Thomas Jefferson in Philadelphia as a delegate to the Continental Congress. He and everyone else there, assembled there, understood the momentous decisions would soon have to be made as the tensions between the 13 colonies and the mother country had been ratcheted ever higher over the past few months. Meanwhile, on May 16, 6 delegates to a convention in Virginia had passed resolutions calling for independence from England, and it went on to call for the creation of a new system of government for the colony of Virginia, not yet quite daring to call it a state. Jefferson desperately wanted to be removed and released from his duties in Philadelphia so he could go to Williamsburg and participate in the formation of a set of fundamental laws, a constitution for Virginia. Nothing seemed more important to him. As Jefferson wrote a fellow delegate, Thomas Nelson, then still in Washington, perhaps Virginia could recall its delegation to Philadelphia for a short while to allow them to return to Williamsburg. It is a work of the most interesting nature and such as every individual would wish to have a voice in. In truth, it is the whole object of the present controversy, writing out the fundamental laws of the state. But Jefferson remained stuck in Philadelphia. So sometime in the next 3 or 4 weeks, he took it upon himself to draft not one, but 3 versions of a proposed constitution for Virginia, with each version differing slightly as his thoughts evolved and his new ideas came to him. Here, in the workplace of his mind, we see Jefferson's first principles revealed. Jefferson was well prepared for such an intellectual exercise. A student of the law under the guidance of George Witt, colonial Virginia's most learned legal scholar, Jefferson had been rigorously schooled not only in the laws and practices of Virginia, but in the legal history of England. While a student at Williamsburg, Jefferson had been urged to go to the Capitol building and watch the colonial delegates at work, getting a first-hand view of governing and practice. First elected himself a member of the Colonial House of Burgesses in December 1768, at the age of 25, Jefferson had 7 years of legislative experience, and he had become recognized as an effective committee member with a sharply analytical mind, deep legal knowledge, and a masterful pen. His 1774 draft of instructions to the Virginia delegates to the Continental Congress, transformed without his permission into a pamphlet entitled A Summary View of the Rights of British America, was an eloquent and forceful laying out of the intellectual and ideological grounds for independence that gained young Jefferson colonial-wide fame for his writing abilities. This pamphlet is the reason Jefferson would be named on June 8, 1776, to a committee of 5 to write out a declaration explaining and justifying the Congress's just finished first reading of a resolution to, quote, dissolve all allegiance to the British Crown. But before that assignment, Jefferson concentrated his efforts on devising a constitution for Virginia. The first draft began with a listing of the supposedly outrageous abuses by the Crown that justified the cutting of ties with England, and hence the necessity of establishing new rules of government. This form Jefferson drew from the 1689 Declaration of Rights English protesters had developed that resulted in the end of the reign of James II and launched that of William and Mary, showing Jefferson's familiarity with English legal history. Then moving to the actual elaboration of a plan of governments, Jefferson first stated that the legislative, executive, and judicial powers shall be forever separate. The legislative branch would consist of 2 houses, with the House of Representatives chosen annually by the voters, while the Senate's members would be chosen by the members of the House and would be appointed for life. While either body could originate, amend, or veto bills, money bills could only originate within the House of Representatives. The Senate was not at all intended to represent property or wealth, but was proposed to include the wisest men of the state, to, if necessary, balance the popularity of the elected House. Jefferson made this clear in a letter to Edmund Pendleton. He said, I had 2 things in view: to get the wisest men chosen and to make them perfectly independent when chosen. I have ever observed that a choice by the people themselves is not generally distinguished for its wisdom. The first secretion from them is usually crude and heterogeneous. But give to those so chosen by the people a second choice by themselves, and they will generally choose wise men. He went on to explain that my observations do not enable me to say that I think integrity the characteristic of wealth. In general, I believe the decisions of the people in a body will be more honest and more disinterested than those of wealthy men. But it's a two-part election process. In Jefferson's first draft, the chief executive of the nation, of the state, called the administrator, would be chosen by the House, have a term of 1 year, and would be incapable of serving again until after 5 years had passed, would have no veto power over the legislature, and in general would have very, very limited powers. This weak executive, of course, was in response to the perceived tyranny of the king. There would also be a privy or an advisory council, although its role was not specified. There would be a series of courts with the judges appointed by the House. Jefferson did not prescribe any precise property holdings necessary for a requirement for voting, but his Constitution proposed giving 50 acres of land to every free white male who was propertyless. This would have resulted in nearly universal white male suffrage. Indian land could not be simply seized, but had to be purchased, and such purchases could only be made by the legislature for public use. Property would descend through all children, ending primogeniture, and citizenship was given to all who promised to abide by the laws of the state and reside here a minimum of 5 years. Citizenship, in other words, was to be based not on blood, but rather on intellectual assent to the values of the society. Then, in lieu of a formal Bill of Rights, the proposed Constitution guaranteed, quote, full and free liberty of religious opinion, and stated that no one shall, quote, be compelled to frequent or maintain any religious service or institution. No free white men would ever be declared debarred the use of arms. There would be no standing army, and printing presses shall be free. These fundamental freedoms were written into the body of the Constitution. Jefferson elaborated upon or tweaked some of his original ideas in his second draft of a Constitution for Virginia. Here he specified the property ownership necessary to vote. He had to own either 50 acres of land or 1/4 of a lot in the town. Prohibited the legislature from passing a law imposing death for any crime besides murder. At that time, dozens and dozens of crimes were punishable by murder, by death. He provided for a deputy administrator to be appointed to assist the administrator or governor, and stated that the Privy Council's duty was to give advice to the administrator when called on by him. Very important later on. With regard to property being inherited, the draft Constitution stated explicitly that females shall have equal rights with males. He also declared no persons hereafter coming to this country shall be held in slavery under any pretext whatsoever, thereby banning the introduction of additional slaves to Virginia. For this new Constitution to take effect, Jefferson proposed that after its approval by the special convention elected to draft it, the new document would be submitted to the people for approval, which would require acceptance by 2/3 of the counties. The actual Constitution that the state enacted, not the one Jefferson proposed, required that on major issues the governor could only act with the advice of the council. And that's going to really be a drawback when Jefferson's governor during the American Revolution. And also it was not sent to the people to be ratified. Jefferson's proposed drafts reached Williamsburg too late to have much influence. The overall Constitution that was adopted in 1776 was far more conservative than the ones Jefferson had proposed, which would have been landmark constitutions. The new Constitution was simply written and ratified by the legislature, not at all the procedure Jefferson would have preferred. He would always see this 1776 Constitution as a form of regular legislation, subject to casual change, rather than a legitimate foundational system of government. And he hoped to replace that 1776 Constitution. After submitting his proposed draft to the convention in Williamsburg, Jefferson attended to his duties in the Continental Congress, including, famously, authoring the Declaration of Independence, a document that helped define the purpose of the United States. But soon he was back in Williamsburg as a member of the House, taking up his new duties. Within a week of going back to the House of Burgesses in Virginia, he authored two bills, one to end entail, a medieval practice of inheritance that helped maintain aristocratic estates, and the other a bill authorizing a general revision of all the laws of the state. His goal, as he described it, was the eradication of every fiber of ancient or future aristocracy. More importantly, the legislature adopted his idea of revising the state's laws, and the November 4 appointed a committee of 5 members to appeal, amend, or revise the laws in force. And Jefferson was the primary member of that committee. It took 3 years for the committee to revise all the laws. It took years for many of them to be approved. Some of them were never approved. But among those were several Jefferson initiatives of great importance. One was to make public lands available at very low cost to small farmers. He proposed a far-reaching system of free public education, 3 years teaching basic literacy and mathematical skills to male and female white students, preparing them to read so as to be kept aware of their rights and to prosper. Now, of course, we're shocked that it's for white only, but the remarkable thing is it was a free public education system for boys and girls in Virginia. Of course, that didn't pass Virginia. Virginia didn't pass a free public education system until 1906. The system also provided an avenue for a small stream of unusually gifted male students to proceed through the upper grades all the way to a free education at the College of William and Mary. Jefferson also sought to revise the state's penal code, eliminating a profusion of crimes punishable by death, adopting a penitentiary system. In addition, he prepared a statute that prohibited the future importation of slaves into the state. Years later, he explained that his idea had been that when this proposed law came up for debate, he and others would then propose amendments for emancipation tied to colonization. However, no such amendments were proposed because, Jefferson wrote, it was found that the public mind would not yet bear the proposition. Perhaps the statute Jefferson believed in most passionately was a bill for establishing religious freedom. Passage of this bill was extremely controversial. A listing of variety of opinions from those who feared religion might collapse if not supported by tax revenue. But Jefferson, ably supported by James Madison, persisted. The bill finally passed in 1786 when Jefferson was in Paris as the American minister to France. It's one of the most important bills in American history. It began with the sentence, Almighty God hath created the man of mind free. Hath created the mind of man free. Then after an elegant philosophical preamble, Jefferson got to the meat of his bill. No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burthened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinion in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. And he wrote that he intended this to be religious freedom, not just for Christians and Jews, but for Mohammedans and Hindus and everybody. I mean, it really was true religious freedom. You kind of wonder if it would have passed today. Once more, as with the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson had authored powerful words that defended the basic liberties of citizens. Jefferson had the ill fortune of serving as governor of Virginia in 1779-81, during which time the state was invaded by British troops. and he barely escaped capture or death at Monticello in June 1781. Jefferson's term soon ended, and that October at Yorktown, British General Cornwallis surrendered to troops commanded by General George Washington. Jefferson was relieved to be able to retire to Monticello, but his happiness ended a few months later when his dear wife died. After months of grief, Jefferson slowly rejoined society and political life in June 1783, when he was elected as a Virginia delegate to the Congress of the Articles of Confederation. Just as he was set underway to go to Philadelphia, he became convinced that the state of Virginia was about to revise that flawed 1776 Constitution. Thinking now that a special convention might be called to revise the Constitution fundamentally, and determined this time not to be too late in getting his own suggestions in, he quickly wrote out a complete draft for a new Constitution for Virginia. And this showed the evolution of his beliefs. Jefferson addressed the draft Constitution to the delegates he expected to be specially elected to a convention for the express purpose of writing a new set of fundamental laws. He called again for 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, judiciary. And the legislature would consist of 2 branches, a House and a Senate. The members of the House would be duly elected by all the voters, and the senators would be chosen in a secondary election by a so-called set of senatorial electors. Again, his idea of a double election for senators. To make sure that this Constitution, unlike that formed in 1776, was of a different order than mere legislation, he specified that the General Assembly would not have the authority to revise the new Constitution, nor could it abridge the civil rights of any person on account of their religious beliefs, or prevent him from professing or supporting his beliefs, or force him to make contributions in support of any other set of beliefs. In other words, Jefferson, in effect, wrote his as yet unpassed Bill for Religious Freedom directly into the new state constitution. The state was forbidden from prescribing death for any crime except murder or treason, for prescribing torture, and from passing bills of attainder, that is, taking away a person's civil rights. It exempted persons from ex post facto laws. It guaranteed the protection of habeas corpus to all persons. Most important, the Constitution prevented the introduction of any additional slaves into the state, and this next point was truly revolutionary. It, quote, outlawed the continuance of slavery, but beyond the generation which shall be living on the 31st day of December, 1800, all persons born after that day hereby declared free. In other words, Jefferson's proposed 1783 Constitution would have ended slavery in Virginia. In this version of the Virginia Constitution, Jefferson provided for the governor's term to be 5 years, but he couldn't be reelected. The governor was given only those powers necessary to execute the laws, and he was not allowed to meddle in affairs deemed legislative or judicial. In remembering how hamstrung he had been by the Privy Council when he was governor, Jefferson here specified that their duty shall be to attend and advise the governor when called on by him. He was really crippled when he was governor by the necessity of the advisory committee seconding what he decided. Then, further to protect the liberties of the citizens, the Constitution ordained that the writ of habeas corpus would be expended to every person residing in the state, that the military would be subordinate to the civil power, and that printing presses would be subject to no restraints save possible libel judgments for publication of false facts. The proposed Constitution would be considered by delegates elected to the special convention for this purpose, and their recommendation would then be submitted to popular vote for approval or rejection. This would be by far the most progressive state constitution in the nation, and far beyond the existing Virginia Constitution. But alas, the state did not call for a convention to revise the Constitution, so all Jefferson's 1783 proposals came to naught. He insisted, though, on publishing the draft as an appendix to his 1787 English edition of the only book he ever published, Notes on the State of Virginia. Within a year of drafting this, his fourth version of a Constitution for Virginia, Jefferson was in Paris, serving as the minister to France. Because he was out of the country, he was not fully aware of the problems that began to emerge in 1785 and 1786, with the Articles of Confederation government proving unable to raise sufficient tax revenues, efficiently regulate commerce, or develop consistent trade policies. He received letters from Madison and others outlining the problem. But Jefferson in Paris did not grasp the sense of crisis that was developing in the new nation. Monroe wrote in 1785 that a congressional committee was going to consider changes to the government so the government could regulate international commerce, but little else was expected. And later that year, Madison wrote that something had to be done regarding tax revenues. Jefferson, far away from the issues at home, wrote on January 24, 1786 that, quote, "The Confederation is a wonderfully perfect instrument, considering the circumstances under which it was formed," although he did admit that some minor changes needed to be made to address the issues of taxes, developing procedures for erecting new states in the West, and arranging commercial treaties with foreign nations. But those in the U.S. viewed the situation as one of crisis, and what became known as Shays' Rebellion in western Massachusetts was seen as a forecast of possible anarchic civil war. Jefferson thought such fears overblown and did not foresee the nature of the coming response. By the late spring of 1787, various correspondents had informed him of a convention to be held in Philadelphia that summer to address the perceived failures of the Confederation Congress. Madison, in a letter, even mentioned, quote, "a new system that would have to be ratified by the people." But a busy Jefferson seems to have overlooked the importance of that phrase. Later, Madison sent him a list of the delegates attending and described the policy of complete secrecy. Jefferson did think the revisions should make one thing very clear. The state should act as one as to everything connected with foreign nations, and several to everything purely domestic. But he was not worried about the changes he imagined might result from the Philadelphia Convention. "It really is an assembly of demagogues," he wrote John Adams in England, then serving as minister to the court of St. James. And without knowing the results of the Philadelphia meeting, Jefferson was inordinately proud of what his American colleagues were doing. "Happy for us," he wrote, "that when we find our constitutions defective and insufficient to secure the happiness of the people, we can assemble with all the coolness of philosophers and set it to rights, while every other nation on earth must have recourse to arms to amend or restore their constitutions." Then in the second week of November 1787, Jefferson received the first of several copies of the new Constitution that various correspondents sent him. His first reaction was negative, partly because of his Revolutionary-era opposition to King George of England, and partly because of his recent experience in Europe, where every major nation was ruled by a powerful monarch. Jefferson wrote to John Adams, "How do you like our new Constitution? I profess there are things in it which stagger all my dispositions. Their president seems a bad edition of a Polish king. He may be elected from 4 years to 4 years for life." Have to say Jefferson was fanatically opposed to monarchalism because he just spent 3 years at this time in England, Europe, where all the major European powers are ruled by monarchs. Any kind of a chief executive whose tenure and powers even hinted at monarchy frightened and infuriated Jefferson. Nothing he thought was more threatening to the liberties of the people. As Jefferson wrote a few months later to George Washington, "I was much as an enemy to monarchy before I came to Europe. I am 10,000 times more so since I have seen what they are." When Adams replied to Jefferson, he wrote back asking, "What think you of a Declaration of Rights? Should not such a thing have preceded the model?" Jefferson instantly agreed, the only surprise being that this had not been his first objection. But from that moment on, the continued electability of the president and the absence of a Bill of Rights were Jefferson's primary objections. Then on December 19, he received a long, masterfully argued letter from Madison, a letter such as only Madison could have written, laying out the history and the logic of the drafting of this Constitution. And this letter allayed all of Jefferson's major worries. In his reply to Madison, Jefferson stated that he much approved of the separation of powers, the ability of the national government to levy taxes, and the ingenious compromise in the legislative branch between large and small states, although he still stated that he did not like the absence of a term limit on the president and the absence of a Bill of Rights. He claimed that such an enumeration of fundamental rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth, and what no government should refuse. But in part because of Madison's persuasive letter, along with the respect Jefferson had for the other drafters and supporters of the Constitution, Jefferson slowly began to come around, liking the Constitution more and more the more he thought about it. He continued to pressure Madison about the absence of a Bill of Rights, as did other such Virginians, as George Mason. And finally, Madison grudgingly gave in because he feared not to do so would jeopardize the chances of the Constitution being approved. At last, on September 13, 1788, the President of Congress announced that the new Constitution had been ratified by a sufficient number of states. Jefferson would be greatly relieved when he learned in early 1789 that Madison had drafted and introduced a series of amendments that guaranteed basic rights, and both houses passed them, and they were just as quickly approved by more than three-fourths of the states. By December 15, 1789, 10 were ratified as amendments to the Constitution, and these first 10 amendments have ever since been known as the Bill of Rights. And when Jefferson soon learned that no one else seemed to share his concern about the presumably lifetime re-electability of the president, he dropped that fear. By now he had become a defender of the Constitution, and like many converts to a cause, he quickly became an enthusiastic defender. In his mind, the words that constituted this foundational governing document guaranteed the liberties of the American people and established an eminently workable, flexible system of government. Time would corroborate those considered judgments. Ambassador Jefferson decided in 1789 to return to Virginia for 6 months or so, bringing his 2 daughters home. But unbeknownst to him, the day before they left Paris, Washington had appointed him Secretary of State, and the very next day, the Senate had approved. So when the boat pulled up at Norfolk, Jefferson was handed a newspaper announcing he had been appointed Secretary of State. He didn't want to go. He wanted to go back to France for 2 years, and he kind of hemmed and hawed. But Madison pushed him, and Jefferson pushed him, and Washington pushed him, and he was finally persuaded to become America's first Secretary of State. Until now, Jefferson's involvement with the constitutions in general had been essentially academic. But now he was in government service again, he would find a growing list of occasions in which constitutional issues took life in very real forms. The famous debate with Hamilton did not begin with Jefferson. Madison had first broken with Hamilton and was the leader of the anti-Hamiltonian movement. When Hamilton proposed a powerful national bank with all its investors drawn from wealthy elites in one portion of the nation, Madison objected for both economic and regional reasons, but he chose to oppose it on the constitutional grounds that such a bank was not authorized by that foundational document. When Washington turned to Jefferson for his opinion, he, probably more out of support for Madison than deep theoretical opposition to the bank itself, offered a strong constitutional objection that has since been known as the principle of strict construction. In his reply, this is a private reply to Washington, not a state document. In his reply, Jefferson began by writing that the foundation of the Constitution lay on the ground that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people. To take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power, no longer susceptible to any definition. This was the kernel of the famously so-called strict interpretation. Jefferson then referred to that clause in the Constitution giving Congress authority to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the enumerated powers. But he wrote, these powers can all be carried into execution without a bank. A bank, therefore, is not necessary and consequently not authorized by that phrase. He elaborated further. Necessary means absolutely essential to achieve a purpose, not merely convenient. But Jefferson, I think because here he realized he was arguing more strongly than he really believed, went on in the final paragraph of this private message to the president to, in effect, take back part of his argument. He wrote, "Unless the president's mind on a view of everything which is argued for and against the bill is tolerably clear, that it is unauthorized by the Constitution, if the pro and the con hang so even as to balance his judgment, that is, if the president can't make up his mind from the arguments, a just respect for the wisdom of the legislature would naturally decide the balance in favor of their opinion." Washington accepted the bank. My point, however, is that the strength of Jefferson's dedication to an absolutely strict construction has been overstated. We'll see later on. The portion of the Constitution that Jefferson most strongly adhered to were those sections, especially including the Bill of Rights, that protected the liberties of American citizens. If there was a central theme in Jefferson's life, it was encapsulated in a phrase he authored in a letter in 1820, the illimitable freedom of the human mind. It is in this light that we should examine Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions, authored in 1798. We must first recall the context in which they were written. In 1798, the Hamilton-led Federalists were totally in charge of the government, both houses, the presidency, every single federal judge, and they were looking for ways to oppress their domestic opponents. At this moment, which Jefferson labeled the reign of witches, Congress passed 4 acts to put down their political enemies. The Naturalization Act extended the time for aliens to have to wait to become citizens from 5 to 14 years. The Alien Act gave the president the authority to deport any foreign-born persons he deemed detrimental to the safety of the nation. The Alien Enemies Act said that in actual wartime, any alien could be arrested or deported. And most important, the Sedition Act made it a federal offense for any person to organize suspiciously, to impede any federal official from carrying out his lawful duties, and to publish any supposedly false, scandalous, and malicious, that is, critical writings aimed at the U.S. government, the Congress, the President, or to aid or even attempt any insurrection, riot, unlawful assembly, or combination thereof. This would mean a complete repression of oppositional political views, with newspaper publishers liable to a fine up to $2,000 and imprisonment for 2 years. An army was raised with an aim in part to crush popular dissent. Just such attacks on the basic freedoms of American citizens had never been seen or contemplated before. Jefferson was absolutely aghast at this state of events. With the entire government structure in the hands of the High Federalist, what could be done? Jefferson did not then or ever believe in secession, for which he used the word scission, meaning a division or split. As he wrote to John Taylor in June 1798, "It is true that we are suffering deeply in spirit and incurring the horrors of a war and long oppression, but who can say what would be the evils of a scission and when and where they would end? Better keep together as we are. If the game runs sometimes against us at home, we must have patience till luck turns, and then we shall have an opportunity of winning back the principles we have lost. Yet something must be done." And Jefferson adopted the concept of the states serving as sentinels to protect against a federal government run wild. No doubt he found this concept articulated in Federalist Number 28, which he did not know had actually been written by Hamilton. In this spirited 1787 defense of the Constitution, Hamilton had written that, quote, "It may safely be received as an axiom of our political system that the state governments will, in all possible contingencies, afford complete security against invasions of the public liberty by the national authority. The state legislatures can discover the danger at a distance. In possessing all the organs of civil power in the confidence of the people, they can at once adopt a regular plan of opposition in which they can combine to all the resources of the community. They can readily communicate with each other and unite their common forces for the protection of their common liberty." Here was the essence of the Kentucky resolutions. Probably in 1798, Jefferson began composing his remonstrance against federal overreach. He reminded his readers that the Constitution gave precise powers to the federal government, and reserved to others to the federal states, several states. Within the realm of the enumerated authority, the national government was supreme, and in fact powerful, but the Constitution carefully circumscribed its powers. Therefore, in Jefferson's words, whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. The central government could not determine the validity of its own actions alone, particularly when every arm of the government was in the hands of the same party. Instead, the various states had an equal right to judge as well as infractions as of the mode of measure of redress. Stating this principle, Jefferson then turned to the Alien Sedition Acts, deeming each an example of the government trespassing its explicit limits. Hence they were, according to the principle of the Constitution, void and of no force, repeating this phrase multiple times. Then, after professing how sincerely anxious he was for the preservation of the Union, he said that when the unpopular laws were not in violation of the Constitution, the remedy was via election of new government officials. But when, in contrast, the unpopular laws were clearly beyond the explicit authority of the Constitution, the states had a natural right to nullify of their own authority. I'll skip some of this, but no southern state formally accepted this, but every southern state seemed to approve this. There was no objection in the South to this idea. And what here Jefferson is doing is he's using the opposition of the states in defense of basic civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and so on. His authorship of these resolutions, widely assumed, removed all doubt that Jefferson had become the head of the Anti-Federalist Party. Then, as you know, Jefferson was involved in an extremely acrimonious election in 1800, when his opponents pilloried him as an atheist, a thief, and a Jacobin French radical. After electoral votes were cast, it turned out that John Adams was defeated, but that Jefferson and Burr were tied because the Constitution did not prepare for anything resembling a party ticket. And in this situation, the Constitution declared that the existing House, not the newly elected House, would vote, each state having one vote, and they would choose from the people who had the most electoral votes. The Federalists now saw their chance. Some of them talked about voiding the election, maybe appointing John Jay or John Marshall president, or even rumors of assassination. Some began to argue that maybe they should try to elect Aaron Burr, because they thought that Aaron Burr had absolutely no principles. But that was to their advantage, because if he had no principles, they could manipulate him. And Hamilton, who hated Adams with a passion, Adams returned that hate, and Hamilton despised Jefferson. But neither his hate for Adams nor his despising of Jefferson came close to his utter hate for Aaron Burr. So after working against Jefferson for several years, Hamilton now turned his incredible energy to get Burr not elected. Finally, on the 37th ballot in the House, James Bayard of Delaware abstained, and then that began the process by which Jefferson became president. He was finally elected in mid-February 1801. He was going to be inaugurated 2 weeks later, so he had 2 weeks to put together a government. He did, and an amazing government. And in fact, his first inaugural address is one of the great public documents in American history. Jefferson faced an issue in 1803 when he desired to get government support for an exploratory expedition to the West, what we know as the Lewis and Clark expedition, because he hungered for knowledge of the West. But he knew the Constitution did not make provision for the active advancement of science. So he wrote a secret proposal to Congress, and he disguised his intentions by proposing the expedition on January 1803 as primarily a means of promoting trade with the Indians. He did, in truth, expect some trade to result from such increased knowledge, but that was not the central motivation for the expedition. In order to work within the restraints of the Constitution, Jefferson stated that the interest of commerce placed the principal object of this proposal within the constitutional powers and care of Congress, supporting commerce, and that it should incidentally advance the geographical knowledge of our continent cannot but be an additional gratification. That's the really reason he pushed it. But he sort of finessed the Constitution without really going beyond it, because he believed the knowledge learned would be so valuable. He likewise had moved beyond strict construction in 1802 to create the U.S. Military Academy, another extension of constitutional authority, because he believed such an academy would serve a national need. He faced a much greater constitutional issue following July 3, 1804, when he discovered that two American ministers to France, Robert Livingston and James Monroe, had signed an agreement to purchase from France the entire French territory west of Mississippi, the Louisiana Territory, for $15 million, about 4 cents an acre, increasing the nation's size by 1/3. They knew they did not have authority to do that, but it was such a good deal. They felt they just had to do it, and they've apologized right and left, but they've told Jefferson, we've done this. We know and when Jefferson gets it, he's almost embarrassed. He also instantly recognized what an incredible boon for the nation. Increasing in size by 1/3, this is the best real estate deal in history. But is it beyond the Constitution? And he began instantly to think about it. He actually began to write out various amendments to the Constitution to make it constitutional for the government to purchase half a continent. And then he gets word that Napoleon is whimsical and mercurial, and Napoleon's having second thoughts, and he gets word if you begin to dilly-dally and talk about constitutionalism, Napoleon will take the whole thing back. And then Jefferson is faced with this dilemma. Do I insist on constitutional consistency and risk losing 1/3 of a continent, or do I push ahead and ask for forgiveness? He pushes ahead. The final document simply said, Louisiana, as ceded by France to the U.S., is made a part of the U.S. It didn't mention constitutional issues. The manifest good of the nation was a higher principle than rigid devotion to constitutional doctrine. Some years later, Jefferson justified his action with regard to the Louisiana Purchase, making clear that by so doing he was not cavalierly disregarding the limits delineated in the Constitution, but sometimes higher duty required leaders to go beyond written laws, even if that meant they might afterwards have to throw themselves on the mercy of the people. Still, in certain cases, it was better to ask forgiveness after the fact than permission before an action. As he wrote to a correspondent in 1810, a strict observance of the written laws is doubtless one of the high duties of a good citizen, but it is not the highest. The laws of necessity, of self-preservation, of saving our country when in danger, are of higher obligation. To lose our country by a scrupulous adherence to written law would be to lose the law itself with life, liberty, property, and all those who are enjoying them with us. Jefferson made clear that such overleaping the law, as he put it, was justified only in the most extraordinary circumstances. As he wrote, it is incumbent on those only who accept of great charges to risk themselves on great occasions, when the safety of the nation or some of its very high principles are at stake. An officer of the government is bound to obey orders, yet he would be a bad one who should do so in cases for which they were not intended and which involve the most important consequences. The line of discrimination between such cases, he admitted, may be very difficult. But the good officer is bound to draw it at his own peril and throw himself on the justice of his country and the rectitude of his motives. This did not mean that Jefferson believed that as new issues and opportunities arose, the president should play fast and loose with the Constitution and simply try to stretch its meaning by interpretation. Rather, he believed that the Constitution should be regularly revised and updated by means of the amending process provided for in the Constitution itself. He never saw the Constitution as so holy that its words should be venerated. It was a decidedly human document. Some men look at constitutions he wrote with sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. They ascribe to the men of the preceding age a wisdom more than human, and suppose what they did to be beyond amendment. I knew that age well. I belonged to it and labored with it. It deserved well of its country. It was very, very much like the present, but without the experience of the present. And 40 years of experience in government is worth a century of book reading. I am certainly not an advocate for frequent and untried changes in laws and constitutions, but I know also that the laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths disclosed, and manners and opinions change with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also and keep pace with the time. We might as well require a man to wear still the jacket which fitted him when a boy, as civilized society to remain ever under the regimen of their ancestors. Let us, he continued, avail ourselves of our reason and experience to correct the crude essays of our first and inexperienced, though wise, virtuous, and well-meaning counsels. And lastly, let us provide in our Constitution for its revision at stated periods. Jefferson never believed that the past should control the present. Almost finished. Jefferson had suggested as much on December 2nd, 1806, in his 6th annual message. With the national debt falling and revenues up, the president suggested utilizing federal funds for the great purposes of public education, roads, rivers, canals, and other such objects of public improvement. It may be thought proper to add to the constitutional enumeration of federal powers. That is, now we've got the opportunity to do things, we need to expand the Constitution. He was advocating improvements that would strengthen the nation. Jefferson was not opposed to strong government when it was within the limits defined by the Constitution. Jefferson never said, that government is best, that government's least. That was Henry David Thoreau. The key was revising the Constitution to accommodate new means and needs. I suppose an amendment to the Constitution by consent of the states necessary because the objects now recommended are not among those enumerated in the Constitution, and to which it permits the public monies to be applied. When in 1825 he opposed an expansive plan of internal improvements proposed by John Quincy Adams, it was because Adams, Jefferson believed, was assuming federal powers not provided for in the Constitution. Jefferson did not oppose internal improvements per se. As he wrote in a document prepared for James Madison addressing Adams' plan, he suggested that the state of Virginia should approve such expenditures provided it be done regularly by the amendment of the compact, that is the Constitution, in the way established by that instrument. The point was clear. While the Constitution should limit federal powers, the Constitution itself should be periodically revised as conditions changed and as the nation matured. Government action should not be crimped by restrictions authored decades ago. The Constitution should be seen, Jefferson believed, as a living, evolving document, carefully changed in response to the times. Only thereby could the nation's prosperity and the citizens' liberties be preserved. That the earth belongs to the living was a central motif in Jefferson's thinking. Hence, laws and constitutions should be revised in response to progress. After all, as he once wrote, nothing is unchangeable but the inherent and unalienable rights of men. Thanks very much.